The mysterious tragedy of the Butterbox Babies is a story of deceit, greed, and murder. Even now, nearly 100 years later, what happened at the Ideal Maternity Home in Westchester, Nova Scotia, still horrifies historians and the descendants of those involved. Well, hello there. I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. Faith Lutanya was born on July 7th, 1940. She was 8 pounds, 6 ounces with deep brown eyes. Her mother, Violet, remembers her wrinkled, rosy skin and had named her on a whim after 2 of the other girls she had befriended in the maternity home she was staying at. Everyone at the home said that Faith was the prettiest baby there. This particular maternity home was popular with unmarried women as it offered them privacy. Violet, however, was a married woman and simply came to the home out of convenience. At that time, the Ideal Maternity Home was the biggest, most modern maternity facility in all of Canada, and it was considered the place to go. Faith had been born healthy, but just a few hours before Violet was set to take her home, the midwife informed her that her 2-week-old daughter had died. She said the baby had become ill during the night and had stopped breathing. The body wasn't fit to be seen as it had already turned black. It didn't cross Violet's mind to question the midwife, but others in the home were suspicious. One mother in the home told Violet that a couple had come to the home in search of a baby girl. And Faith Lutanya was the only girl in the nursery at that time. And there were the lingering doubts about the body that no one ever saw. What Violet didn't know is that at the time Faith was born, the home and its owners were being investigated by child welfare officials. Lila Gladys was born in 1899. She was the daughter of devout Seventh-day Adventist parents in Nova Scotia. After high school, she became a teacher, and at the age of 25, she met 26-year-old William Peach Young. William was also a Seventh-day Adventist, and this seemed to influence much of what he did. He saw himself as a medical missionary and was passionate about helping the sick. William graduated from medical school in 1923, and 2 years later, he and Lila got married. Lila got pregnant right away, and they eventually went on to have a total of 5 children. William and Lila were living in Chicago while William was becoming a chiropractor, and Lila went back to school to train to become a midwife. Once they were finished with their training in February of 1928, they moved back to Nova Scotia, where they purchased a 4-bedroom home with some land and opened the Life and Health Sanitarium in East Chester. Their slogan was, "Where the sick get well." At the time, it sounds like their hearts were truly in the right place and they really wanted to help people. Now, one quick side note, this was kind of around the same time that Kellogg, the cornflakes guy, that was around the same time that he had the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and he was also a Seventh-day Adventist, which I actually did a video all about him and some of the crazy things that he believed. So if you guys want to check that out, I will link that above and at the end of the video so you can check that out later. But I just thought that was interesting, and I kind of wonder if they were at all influenced by him, because his sanitarium was highly successful back at that time. I don't know. I didn't do any research into that, but that was something that just seemed interesting to me. So the Youngs quickly realized that things weren't going to be as easy as they initially thought. They barely had enough money to supply enough cots for their patients in their small East Chester cottage. So this is when the wheels in Lila's head started turning, and it seems like she was kind of just trying to find other ways to make their sanitarium more profitable. And one thing she noticed is that there was an extreme need for maternity care in the area. World War II had taken a toll on the region and resources were limited. Young Navy men would come into the port, have a good time, blow off some steam, and then they would pack up and leave, leaving behind quite a few young teenage girls who now had to figure out how to handle the consequences of said rendezvous all on their own. And of course, all of this was during a time when it was extremely frowned upon to be unmarried and pregnant. And when their pregnancy was discovered, many of these young girls would be kicked out by their families. And unfortunately, this was how young women were treated, even if this pregnancy was as a result of an assault. Another byproduct of the war was lots of widowed women who were expectant mothers as well, which The widows didn't really have to deal with the social shame attached to their pregnancy, but they still had the same financial strain of trying to figure out how they were going to pay for all the medical expenses attached to labor, delivery, and then, of course, feeding and clothing and taking care of a baby by themselves. So Lila saw this influx of unwed mothers needing care as an opportunity. This was a great need in the market that she and William had the skills to fill. So the Youngs decided to pivot from their existing business and open a center specifically for pregnant women. William and Lila rechristened their business as the Ideal Maternity Home, with William as superintendent and Lila as managing director. They knew that one of the biggest issues for these unwed mothers was the shame attached to being pregnant and not being married. So the Youngs marketed themselves as being discreet, and unmarried mothers began to flock to the couple's establishment in response to newspaper ads that promised them a safe haven. One such advertisement read, "Dame Gossip has set many young lives to perdition after ruining them socially, that might have been bright stars in society and a power in the world of usefulness had they been shielded from gossip when they made a mistake." I can never get over the way people used to talk. Maybe it was better. I don't know. It just seems like a lot of extra words. Now, there were maternity homes out there during this time, usually ran by the Catholic Church, where some families would send their daughters to just hide them away while they were pregnant. But there was nothing like that in this area, and there really was a great need for it. Everything about the way the maternity home was marketed told young women that they really cared. They didn't judge them in a way that the rest of the society or maybe even those other maternity homes did. They understood that these were young women who had simply made a mistake and the rest of their lives shouldn't be ruined because of it. So you could come live at this home, wait out your pregnancy, and even adopt out your baby if you wished. Go away for a long vacation, come back home as if nothing had ever happened. All of this advertising and word of mouth quickly gained the Youngs a reputation for protecting unwed mothers from the accusing eyes of society as a whole. The response from the community was enormous and money started flooding in. What had started out as a 4-bedroom cottage expanded to a larger home with 54 bedrooms and a nursery that held anywhere from 80 to 100 babies at any given time. And while Lila, she was a midwife, but she was calling herself an obstetrician. So people were coming there thinking she was a doctor. Their services now included maternity care for unwed mothers and private placement of unwanted infants. On the surface, this place sounded amazing, especially to a desperate young woman who had nowhere else to turn. William and Lila really seemed like they wanted to help these young, unmarried, expectant mothers. And the women were so grateful to have a place to go. But because this was a business, the mothers were charged an upfront fee to come and stay, which helped to pay for their room and board and all their medical care during the pregnancy. But the Youngs also allowed any women who couldn't afford to pay for their services to stay after the delivery and work off their debt. They would do things like all the chores around the home and help take care of any babies that were waiting to be adopted. Something very unique, though, about the Ideal Maternity Home was that they also allowed married women to come and stay and give birth there. And their home was also appealing to married women because this was a very rural area and all of the hospitals were pretty far away. The community and local politicians were in awe of everything that the Youngs were doing. People were so amazed at how above and beyond they went to help these young mothers who were an average age of 17, and how much the Youngs seemed to truly value their privacy. They even went so far as to give the girls fake names to go by during their stay in order to protect their privacy. And because of all this good publicity, the Youngs were flooded with donations from locals who loved what they were doing and wanted to help. But as the business grew more and more lucrative, it seems as though the Youngs just started to see dollar signs and focused less and less on healthcare and more on their profits. In a time when the average weekly wage was $8, the Youngs were charging these mothers $300 to $500. They started out by quoting these mothers anywhere from $100 to $200 in advance for the room and board, but then once the baby was born, they would tack on fees for the delivery, caring for the baby in the nursery, the adoption, and they would also demand outrageous prices for every little thing that they used for the baby. Like they would charge them $12 diapers, which I don't know what diapers cost back in those days, but if the weekly wage was $8, diapers didn't cost $12, right? I mean, it's also interesting if you think that diapers were reusable back in those days. So it seems kind of crazy that they charged them at all, because that would kind of be like charging people for using linens, right? Like you wash them and reuse them. Now, on top of all of that, if the baby died, the Youngs would then charge the poor grieving mother an additional $20 for the funeral expenses. So this meant that the women who couldn't afford to pay were working quite a long time to pay off their debt. Some sources claim that some of these women worked there for as long as 5 to 10 years. That's like indentured servitude. I kind of wonder if any of them ever tried to run off and didn't pay. Now, and of course, it's said that they used blackmail to keep them there, but I honestly do wonder if any of them ever got away and didn't pay. I would be curious to know that. Now, the Youngs were also rumored to have performed procedures to bring an early end to an unwanted pregnancy, which of course was illegal at that time. So it sounds like everyone involved in this whole situation had reason to keep their mouths shut. So maybe between that and the blackmail, that's how they got away with this. That would only make sense to me. Now, just to quickly go over the fees, they charged the moms $25 for the delivery, plus several dollars per day for room and board, $12 for those diapers, which I read some stories that said it was an individual diaper. They would charge them $12 a piece, which is outrageous. And then another $300 for the adoption fee. You can see how this would add up super quickly. And it makes sense that some of these women would had to have stayed there for years to pay the Youngs back. So while it initially sounds like, oh, how nice, they're letting those people who can't afford to pay work for it, it turns out that they were blackmailing most of these young women by threatening to expose them if they didn't pay up or work as a servant to pay them back. There were also women who would give birth somewhere else, and they would just bring their babies to the maternity home to have them placed for an adoption. And the Youngs promised those women that the $300 adoption fee would ensure that the child received a lifetime of care. Now, the biological mothers weren't the only ones getting the shaft from the Youngs. They were also charging the adoptive parents astronomical adoption fees. But let's be honest here. These weren't normal adoptions. They were selling babies. They were charging the mothers all these fees, including an adoption fee, and then turning around and charging the adoptive parents anywhere from $1,000 up to $10,000, which is about $160,000 in today's money. And you might be wondering, where were all these adoptive parents coming from? Well, at that time in the United States and in Canada, it was illegal for parents to adopt a baby across religious lines. So if you were a Christian, you had to adopt a baby whose parents had been Christian. Or if you were Jewish, then you had to adopt a Jewish baby, which I know, super dumb, but that's how it was at that time. So there just weren't enough Jewish babies to go around. And so this all meant that there was a shortage of babies for Jewish parents in America to adopt. Researchers at the History Department of Rutgers University, who study the baby selling trade between the United States and Canada, say that the Youngs operated for years unimpeded by laws governing adoption because at that time there just weren't any. The Youngs benefited from being at the right place at the right time. The Nova Scotia coast drew vacationers from New York and New Jersey, many of whom were childless. So when people started hearing about the Ideal Maternity Home and how the Youngs were willing to disregard the ridiculous, unbreakable religious rule that all of the legal American and Canadian adoption agencies followed, many Jewish American couples started traveling to Canada for vacation, and then they would come back with a baby. The Youngs were willing to write whatever they wanted on the birth certificate, and they weren't regulated in the same way that the adoptions agencies in the States were, at least not at first, and so they were charging these astronomical fees, and people paid it. Over the years, it sounds like adoptive mothers started to notice that maybe things weren't as peachy as the Youngs made it appear, but they were also benefiting from this illegal activity. So if they felt something was off, they kind of just turned a blind eye to it. They probably also thought that, hey, they were helping these babies. But where we really start to take an even darker turn is when the Youngs started telling mothers that their babies had died so that they could turn around and sell the completely healthy and alive baby to a couple that was willing to pay. This happened with married and unmarried mothers alike. Often with the unmarried mothers, they would first try to coax them into giving up rights to their baby. They would use extreme pressure, telling them how much better of a life their baby would have and all of this stuff. But if none of that worked and the mother still wanted to keep her baby, well, the Youngs would then lie and say that the baby had died just so that they could make another sale. And this is believed to be what happened to Violet, you know, the poor woman that I talked about at the beginning of the episode. Well, when Violet gave birth to her daughter in July of 1940 at the Ideal Maternity Home, she had a very difficult birth. Faith had been born breech, which is a very dangerous delivery. But despite that, Faith and Violet had both come through the delivery perfectly fine. Violet had stayed at the maternity home for 2 weeks after giving birth just to kind of recover from such a difficult delivery. So she would nurse her baby, and then Lila would take Faith back to the nursery, and that's kind of how their days went on for 14 days. But then one day, Lila came into Violet's room holding Faith, but she stayed too far away from Violet, like she wouldn't come near her, and Lila said that the baby was ill and it was not looking good for her. Then the next morning, Lila comes in and informs Violet that Faith had gotten worse overnight and she had died. Violet was shocked. She didn't understand how this could possibly have happened because she had just been feeding her baby a few hours earlier and she had appeared perfectly healthy. But at the same time, it didn't really even cross her mind to question what Lila was telling her because Lila was the medical professional after all, and so she just trusted what she told her. Even when Lila told her that she couldn't see her baby's body because it had already turned black. Her husband, however, did not accept this explanation and he demanded to see the child. But at the insistence of the Youngs that the baby's body had already turned black, Violet's mother urged him to please just let it go. I think she was probably just feeling for her daughter and she was trying to keep her from having to deal with any additional trauma from this whole situation. Violet says she was completely numb and doesn't remember the funeral at all. In her mind, she can still hear her husband and her father arguing that night, threatening to dig up the grave themselves. Still, she never questioned the situation until one of the other mothers confided in her that she had heard a couple at the home requesting to adopt a baby girl on the very night that Faith had supposedly died. Faith was the only baby girl in the nursery at that time, and the couple had left happy, presumably having gotten what they came for. Over the years, as more and more information came to light, Violet became convinced that her baby had not died, and she wanted to find out for sure. In 1996, 56 years after her daughter was buried, Violet had the remains exhumed and DNA tested. Unfortunately, the results were inconclusive. But in an interview done in 1999, nearly 60 years after giving birth, a 78-year-old Violet had still not given up hope of one day finding her daughter. "My baby is alive. She didn't die," Violet says. "She was stolen." The more you dig into this place, the worse it gets. Because apparently any baby who Lila thought didn't have potential of being adopted out, aka she couldn't sell them, she would just neglect and let them die. Now, if you didn't catch my episode on Victorian baby farming, you can listen to that one next. I'll put it up here and also at the end of this episode. But I briefly mentioned in that video the Butterbox Babies and that Lila and William Young are now considered some of the most notorious baby farmers. And one of the things that put them on the list is something that Lila would do, which is instead of feeding them some type of milk, she would feed the babies only molasses mixed with water. And for some reason, this seemed to be a popular method among baby farmers. We talked about that in that episode as well. And I'm not sure if maybe it was just kind of supposed to stop the babies from being fussy while they became more and more malnourished, but this would typically cause the child to die within 2 weeks. And it's reported that this was done to any child who was left with Lila for adoption, but whom she considered unfit for adoption. So can you imagine some of these mothers that were even giving birth somewhere else were bringing their baby to her, paying her $300 for her to starve them. Like, they thought they were paying $300 for her to take care of them, put them into a nice home, but in reality, she was taking their $300 and then just starving their child to death. So terrible. Now, reports claim that Lila is the one who determined which children were unadoptable, and these reasons ranged anywhere from having some type of birth defect to what she considered was the wrong color of skin, or even just having a birthmark somewhere on their body. If she didn't think that she had a customer for the baby, then she condemned that baby to death. Researchers now believe that hundreds of babies were deliberately starved in this way at the Ideal Maternity Home. Once these babies passed away, they would bury them in butter boxes from the local dairy, and this, of course, is where the nickname Butterbox Babies came from. Now, as terrible as it sounds because of the way that they died or were killed, these butter boxes were really just white pine boxes, so honestly, I don't see how they were much different than actual coffins were back in those days. I think it's really just the idea of basically using recycled dairy boxes for children. That kind of just sounds wrong to people. Now, years later, a woman would come forward saying that she had been the one who lined the boxes with satin material for the babies, and then there was also a caretaker who had come forward admitting to have buried more than 100 babies in the field behind the Ideal Maternity Home that was adjacent to a nearby cemetery. Now, I mentioned earlier that when a baby would die during childbirth or shortly after, the Youngs would charge the birth mother a $20 fee for the funeral. These Butterbox burials are what they were paying for. But if they didn't have anyone to pay for this $20 burial, the Youngs would simply burn the baby's bodies in the home's furnace, or they would pass the child off to a local fisherman who would just toss the body into the sea. And at this point, it really seemed that the Youngs were just willing to do whatever it took to keep their high-paying customers happy. If someone wanted twins, they would take two totally unrelated babies and boom, there you go, twins. And they were also known to separate actual twins if they had a customer who was only wanting one baby. In addition to babies who died due to birth complications and being purposefully starved, many additional deaths occurred due to unsanitary conditions and also from the Youngs taking in more children than they could physically take care of. Of course, the majority of these deaths and births, for that matter, were never reported, and any records that were left in the home were destroyed in a fire in the 1960s. So we really have no way of knowing the full extent of all of this, but in the 20 years that the Ideal Maternity Home was in operation, researchers estimate that between 400 and 600 babies died at the home, and anywhere from 700 to 1,500 children were adopted out. Many of those who were lucky enough to survive the home were said to still suffer from ailments caused by the unsanitary condition and lack of care at the home. As the business grew and sanitary issues got worse and worse, pregnant mothers, of course, saw this. The delivery rooms were dirty, the babies were just not being well taken care of, but they were either unable to prove wrongdoing or they were just afraid to expose the Youngs' crimes because then they'd be outing themselves as well. Not that they were necessarily doing anything wrong, but many of them were trying to hide the fact that they had ever gotten pregnant in the first place. So all of this secrecy meant that the home continued to thrive, and by the mid-1940s, the yearly revenue for the home is reported to have been $60,000. Now, of course, this was only what was reported to the government. This did not include any of the baby sales, which of course was the majority of their revenue. If you take the more conservative numbers and say that they sold around 700 babies for an average cost of $5,000, that would mean that the Youngs made about $3.5 million with their illegal baby selling operation. Of course, it wasn't just babies dying at the Youngs' house of horrors. Many of the young mothers died under suspicious circumstances as well. In the spring of 1935, Eva Neiforth of Nova Scotia was in love with a man named Walter. Eva found out that she was pregnant, and being that the two were not married, wanted to keep the pregnancy hidden. Eva learned about the Ideal Maternity Home and decided it was the perfect solution to her problem. She arrived at the maternity home just before Christmas Christmas, and the Youngs took her in. Eva had only been there for about a week when she contracted an infection and became bedridden until the end of January when she went into labor. The labor was rough and Eva barely made it out alive. Unfortunately, her baby passed away shortly after birth, and by the next day, Eva was still really sick and fighting for her life. William had written Walter, the boyfriend, to inform him of the situation with Eva, and so Walter comes to visit Eva at the maternity home, and he was surprised to find out that Eva had not been given any antibiotics to help her with the infection due to the fact the maternity home did not have any available. Walter insisted that William call a doctor to come out. William got super offended by that. He said that he was a doctor and it was completely unnecessary to go and involve a third party. So Walter's there. He's super worried about Eva. He can tell she's extremely sick. He's having this argument with William, and Lila comes into the room, takes him aside and tells him, hey, the baby didn't make it, the baby passed away, and then just hands him a bill for $25, 20 of which was for the burial of the baby. So Walter goes ahead and pays the bill, and then he's immediately told that visiting hours are over and asked to leave. 2 days later, Eva had passed away. Despite the Ideal Maternity Home's secrecy and initial really good reputation, over time rumors did start to swirl, and by 1933, the Youngs' business had attracted the attention of the Nova Scotia child welfare director and health minister, who had been hearing all these rumors and theories about suspicious baby deaths at the maternity home. And so the director ordered sporadic investigations, and he forced the Youngs to hire a registered nurse. The nurse was supposed to be kind of keeping an eye on things, seeing what went on behind closed doors and all of that. But of course it was just her, and she didn't work 24/7 at the maternity home. And so she only got to see a small part of how the home was run, and it kind of sounds like maybe they just put on a show for her, and then when she wasn't there, they kind of just did their own thing, and eventually the maternity home was right back to its old ways. A year after Eva's death in 1936, the Youngs were charged with manslaughter for both Eva and her baby. A pathologist testified that he had performed a post-mortem exam on Eva and her baby and discovered that Eva had died because she had contracted an infection caused by the use of dirty instruments during the delivery, and the baby had died due to improper use of forceps. So basically, Lila had used a pair of forceps to assist in the delivery. Not only was she not trained on these forceps or legally allowed to use them, but she also had not sterilized them properly, which meant she gave Eva an infection and she crushed the baby's skull by using them improperly. So horrifying. The Youngs took the stand to deny these charges, and in May of 1936, they were acquitted. However, public health officials really felt at this time that there was something not good going on at this maternity home, and so they continued their investigation, just trying to get something to stick. So sometime between 1945 and 1946, health officials won some convictions against the Youngs for violating new adoption licensing laws. Of course, this didn't really do anything to them, and they continued operating their illegal business. But after some other unsuccessful investigations and charges, the Montreal newspaper ran an article exposing the couple's maternity home as the ruthless mercenary operation that it was. The expose highlighted the home's questionable medical care, the Youngs' international child trafficking business, and the killing of Butterbox Babies. But even after all of this, it was Lila's own arrogance that would be her downfall. You see, she was super mad at the publishing company that had run the expose on her maternity home, and she filed a $25,000 libel lawsuit against them for defamation in 1947. What she didn't realize is that by bringing this lawsuit to court, this gave authorities reason to come in and do a bunch of further investigations. They had to prove if the expose was defamation or actually true, right? Now, this is where there's a little bit of confusion as to how much of this information came out before the trial in their previous investigation versus how much came out because of the lawsuit that Lila had filed. But we do know that the health officials had been investigating the Youngs for more than 10 years prior to this expose coming out. And it sounds like the Youngs had always just been really good at hiding things by blackmailing people into keeping silence or completely lying. And nothing really ever came from these investigations until this trial, which of course was Lila's own doing. So when public health officials paid a visit to the maternity home as part of their investigation, they were shocked at what they saw. Their rooms were filthy, reeked of urine. All of the linens were dirty. There were flies everywhere, and the babies were all severely malnourished. Now, one of the biggest things that caught their attention is that most of the infants weighed only half of what would be considered a healthy weight for their age. And so this, of course, raised immediate concerns. Pediatricians and mothers came forward during the trial to testify against the Youngs. They noted that the home was overcrowded and deadly. One mother admitted that her baby had died after receiving no medical attention and was buried in a Butterbox. That same mother admitted that the Youngs had coerced her into posing as a nurse during some of the health department inspections. And another woman opened up about lying on adoption forms and saying that her child was Jewish in order to cater to the Jewish adoptive parents that the house served. I also read that there was an adoptive mother at some point who had reported the Youngs because she was shocked at how unsanitary the baby nursery was. So I'm not sure at what point that happened, but I did want to mention that because not all of the adoptive parents were willing to just turn a blind eye. It sounds like the Youngs were just really good at weaseling out of things for years and years, and they had built such a good reputation with local officials and townspeople that it really took quite a while for people to come around and see them for who they really were. That does make me wonder if other adoptive parents had reported them and nothing had really just ever come of it. As a result of all of this, some Butterbox babies' corpses were discovered and exhumed, but it was really impossible at that time for them to prove the cause of death. So this meant that William and Lila were never charged with the deaths of any of these babies despite the heinous atrocities that they had committed. They were, however, convicted on 3 of the counts that were brought against them, but they were only fined $150, which of course was a slap on the wrist and did nothing to deter them. Another time they were brought to court and convicted of illegally selling babies to 4 different American couples, but once again their punishment was simply a fine of $428.90. Throughout all of this, Lila, of course, tried to fight back. She claimed that the officials were harassing her, but it didn't matter because it was too late. Their good reputation had finally ended. That November, the Youngs were ordered to shut down the home and their licenses were revoked. But the Canadian legal system had yet to understand the depths of which some criminals are willing to go, and the Youngs continued taking women in. Whether these two truly cared in the beginning and things just got out of hand, greed got to them, or they were just cold-hearted monsters from the very beginning, we may never know. But eventually, all of the negative publicity did get to them. William became a drunk, and Lila just continued to live in her delusions, refusing to adhere to the laws or concern herself with the health and well-being of the babies she helped birth. Eventually, though, the Youngs did get tired of fighting back to save the maternity home, and they closed it down. As a result of all of these lawsuits, the Youngs were officially broke from spending all of their money on court and lawyer fees. They both eventually died of cancer in the 1960s. Child welfare authorities in Canada and America were so concerned with what the Youngs had done that they developed new laws to protect adopted children. The 1992 book, Butterbox Babies, was written by Betty Cahill. The scandalous story story of the Ideal Maternity Home created a sensation. Betty wrote this book along with hundreds of other people who were directly connected with the home. She found the woman who had lined Butterbox coffins with satin and a man who had admitted to burying dozens of babies in Butterboxes in a field. She found survivors in New York and New Jersey. She talked to one of the mothers who had been told her daughter had died, only to be reunited with her daughter years later. She talked to Violet and wrote about Faith in a chapter titled Stolen Baby. Survivors have since held memorial services and constructed a monument to those who lost their lives inside the Ideal Maternity Home. And there's even a Facebook group dedicated to bringing these families together. And it's actually still active. If you go, you can see posts of people who are looking for family members who they believe had a connection to the home. And these survivors also recognize the loving adoptive parents who may have saved their lives, bringing new meaning to the words, "You were chosen."